adversity is so loud, and it challenges our ability to see, to perceive the presence of a God who says, I don't change and I don't lie.
Yeah.
So when our heart is in this tension of adversity is so loud, I don't think the first step is to try to block off the adversity, or to block off, or to walk in denial of, as I like to say, to pretend like this isn't happening. What do we do to find the presence of the God who does not change when adversity is really loud? Because the still small voice vies for our attention, as does very loud adversity.
That's right. And I think part of it is understanding how your brain works. I mean, having an awareness before you have these massive things happen, that your brain, when you're faced with trauma, tells you all kinds of automatic thoughts that are loud, like you said. They drown out things that are true. And especially if you have made a common mistake that humans make of defining your happiness or your peace or your hope on things that can be taken from you. So if you think you have to have a certain spouse or job or amount of money, or that all your kids have to outlive you, and you lose one of those things, then all of a sudden the things that you built your hope on are lost. So when you face this great adversity, the first thing you start hearing is all of the lies that you believed about what your life was supposed to be, or what you thought was always going to be true, right? And so I think what happens then is you have to develop this space, this practice, this discipline of hearing the negative thought and looking for a better one to replace it with. I call it biopsying because I'm a brain surgeon. But this idea of grabbing a thought, looking at it carefully, and saying, what does God really want me to feel and think and hear in this moment? And those still small voices, like you said, will start showing up. He's faithful to hold on to present his promises to you in those scary moments, but you have to listen and actively look for them.
Okay, so if we have to be intentional about looking for them, watching for them, developing the space to see them, as you just said, what's the lane that we need to walk in so that we can do that, versus developing a callus of self-protection that's forming over our heart? I think about even your professional experience as a neurosurgeon, but also a former combat surgeon in Iraq. So when you're walking through this choice to see what we need to see, how do you do that, and what do you do so that the callus of self-protection doesn't just insulate your heart from feeling the very real pain? There's another tension in that.
You're right. It's a great question, too. And I think it should be said that most of us who go through these hard things and then later write books about them didn't get it right the first time we went through it. And that's why we had to like for me, when I encounter a problem, I usually look back at all the different ways I messed it up. And that's what I write books about. Like, how could I have done this better so I can teach somebody else how to not to do some of those things? Like when I got home from Iraq, as you mentioned a couple of times, I had seen all this combat and all this death and all these bad, horrible things that you can't put out of your mind. And I went through a season where I had what really could be defined as PTSD for a while. And I'm a trained neurosurgeon. I understand the neuroscience of what my brain is doing, and I'm still having nightmares and daydreams and flashbacks and all this. It's disordered sleep and all those things. And I think that what I learned from all of that is you do put up this brain barrier to try to block out those feelings and thoughts. And the problem with any type of behavior that tries to make us not feel what we're needing to feel, and sometimes those behaviors are numbing behaviors that we use alcohol, or we use shopping, or we use gambling, or whatever it might be for an individual, right? But the problem, as Brene Brown has said so well, you can't selectively numb anything. If you numb part of your heart, you numb your whole life, and you can't feel the stuff you need to feel. And I think about the story in 2 Kings in the Bible when King David, the famous story, he had a child with Bathsheba, and God promised that the child was going to die. And he's fasting and praying and weeping and begging God not to make it so, right? And then he gets word that the baby dies. And the next thing he does is get up and wash his face and change clothes and call for something to eat and goes back to work. And his advisors all say, wait a minute, your child just died. Like, why are you going back to work? And he said, well, I can't do anything about it now. I just need to get busy, and then I won't think of it. Basically, he's going to replace grieving with working, right? And that turns out to be a terrible mistake, because the rest of the book talks about all the different ways his family became progressively more dysfunctional. And the Bible says the sword never departed from his house. Like, his children were killing each other, and sons were raping daughters, and he had a broken relationship with all his other kids. And it turns out, if you look at it with what we know in the 21st century, he didn't process his trauma properly, and he didn't grieve properly, and he didn't let his heart come back alive in a careful way, and he basically just covered up the pain with work and with whatever else kings entertain themselves with. And we can see a man whose life is ruined by failing to heal from trauma. And that's what I think this adversity puts us in the situation of doing, and we have to be diligent to try to make sure that we don't just develop some alternative way to busy ourselves so we don't feel it.
I want to put a pin in dealing with processing trauma properly. That's a huge part of this conversation, and we'll get there. But I don't want to jump the gun too fast. I think I want to ask a couple scientific questions. First of all, as a neurosurgeon, talk to me about how trauma affects the brain.
Trauma affects the brain in numerous ways, but the number one way is that it puts you into this constant, perpetual state of fight or flight, right? So your brain has multiple different areas that make you feel what you're used to feeling. And the problem with neurochemical response that makes you feel fear is that feeling that you define and identify as fear isn't specific to the threat underneath it, or even if there is a threat. And so, like, for example, if you opened your garage tomorrow morning and there was a grizzly bear in your garage, you would be afraid naturally, and you would have all the physiological responses of fear. Your heart would race and your mouth would get dry and you'd want to run away, because your limbic system, that's responsible for telling you what to do when you're afraid, has two options: put up a fight or run away, right? Mm-hmm. But if you just hear a sound in the middle of the night when you're asleep, and your brain tells you there's an intruder in my house who's here to murder my family, you will feel the same stuff that you felt when that real threat with the grizzly bear was in your house, right? You will feel exactly the same stuff. The difference is there's not really a threat this time. And that's what happens when there's trauma, is your fight or flight engine turns on and overwhelms the rest of your brain. It makes you feel like you're constantly in danger, or makes you feel like you're constantly about to experience the thing that you went through before. And so part of understanding how to help people who have been through trauma, the buzzword now is trauma-informed care, right? When we take care of somebody who's been through something hard now, we used to look at behaviors, and I would have a patient in the ER who was drunk and fighting and doing all, cursing and doing all these things, and we would say, what's the matter with you? Why are you behaving this way? And what we've learned is that most of the time people's behavior is dictated by their experiences, and a better question is, what happened to you that's producing this behavior that we're seeing that's harmful to you and to us? How can we unpackage and discover the underlying things that have occurred in your life that led you to this place and this time and this behavior? So if we do that to ourselves, if we apply the same lens to ourselves in the same question, we would say, I need to start trying to understand why I feel some of the things that I feel, right? Mm-hmm. And one thing I teach my people on my writings and my podcast is I say, you need to understand this is true. It's not easy to accept, but it's true. Feelings are not facts. Feelings are chemical events in your brain, and they point towards things that may or may not be facts. And so our job then is, if you will, good self-brain surgeons or good humans, is to learn how to understand what we're feeling and detach it from an experience that may or may not be actually occurring, and then try to diagnose where that feeling came from so that we can try to really properly heal from it.